Hi, Dr. Lou Pulsver here to talk at some length about avoiding player elimination in game designs. Now, this was not a problem traditionally. Player elimination is common in traditional games and no one seemed to mind. So Monopoly, Risk, Diplomacy, players are gradually eliminated until only one is left. In Diplomacy, it's until one player controls half the board, with the idea that the rest of them don't have a chance, but by then several players have been eliminated. Now in race games like Pachisi, Backgammon, and others, you don't usually have player elimination, nor do you in card games. But in board games it was not unusual. Now, of course, I'm talking about games there that have more than two players. In two-player games, player elimination just means the game is over, as in checkers or chess more or less. So that's not a problem either. And most traditional games, especially classic games before the era of commercial games, are just two-player games. They're not games for more than two players. It's also not been a problem in video games. In the arcade game era, games were made with the idea that the player would be eliminated fairly quickly so that he would put in more money to play again. And when single-player games became common in the household, players were able to save the game, and so they just go back to their save and play again. No problem if they got eliminated. Or they were allowed to respawn more or less infinitely, or both. In massively multiplayer online games, players are allowed to respawn with little or no permanent harm. In multiplayer games, as the term is used in video games, where you have two teams, there's usually infinite respawning. You just have to wait a little while before you respawn. So no one is eliminated before game end in any of these games. However, this is a problem in tabletop games. And tabletop games nowadays are perhaps played more often with 3 or more players than was true in the past. They're social experiences. And the idea is you can't have fun if you're not playing anymore and your friends are. Now, there's an opposite point of view here, that is, playing from a hopeless position, one you can't win with, is no fun. But that seems to be the less common point of view. In any case, player elimination is very much frowned upon in tabletop games for more than two sides. And of course, we still are not in a position where there are many video games for more than two sides. So what do we do to avoid player elimination? Well, in non-conflict games, you frequently have a situation where the players are presented with a puzzle to solve. Everything is positive. You get better at the solution until you've mastered it. So even if you don't win the game, the particular game you're playing right now, you're getting better at the game and you can feel good about yourself. This avoids player elimination and at the same time avoids the problem of who wants to play a losing position, because you're still learning. It's very clever. But what about that playing a losing position? Well, in these kinds of non-conflict games, there's often a catch-up mechanism so that a player can mess up for half of a game or even 2/3 of a game and still have a significant chance to win. Not as good a chance as somebody else who's been paying attention and doing their best, but still a significant chance to win. And this partly goes back to the roots of many of those games as family games on steroids, as they're called. Typically in such games, the values and the rewards escalate as the game progresses. So if you mess up early, it's not a big deal. If you mess up late, it is a big deal because you're working with bigger numbers and bigger values. Now there are some games where this is not the case. For example, engine games, or what I call economic snowball games. Because if you get your engine started late, or if you get your snowball going late, then you're doomed. You're going to lose. Conflict games which are usually war games, not always, are a different proposition. These are games with strong conflict where you can directly hinder and affect other players. What do we do to avoid player elimination? Keep in mind, risk and diplomacy, the traditional multi-sided games of that kind, both have player elimination. The first thing is to keep in mind that country elimination is not the norm in real wars, though it does happen. And of course, in two-player war games, elimination is okay because that's naturally the end of the game. In fact, there are a lot more two-player war games than there are multi-sided war games. Now, to go back to video games a moment, you can have multi-sided video games, but typically it's one player and many computer opponents. Well, nobody cares if computer opponents are eliminated. Nobody feels bad about it. And if the player is eliminated, the game is over. So what you have in effect is a two-player game. So how do you avoid elimination in conflict games, player elimination? The obvious way is to end the game before anybody can be eliminated. This usually means a game with victory points where you play to a certain number of points, or a turn-limited game, you play a certain number of turns, and sometimes both. And if not turn limits, it could be time limits. Either way, the game usually ends before someone is eliminated. Every once in a while, someone really messes up and they get eliminated, but they've probably done so badly that they don't mind getting out of there. Now, once again, keep in mind that modern European wars, and by modern I mean early modern Europe, the 7 Years' War, and even in the Napoleonic Wars, ended this way, that there was some kind of limit, the exhaustion of the countries, and no country was eliminated. And that was true until World War I, where, practically speaking, Austria-Hungary was eliminated, and so was Tsarist Russia. Even in Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon was taken out, but France was left with full independence. It was a war against Napoleon in the end, not a war against France, although it started as a war against France. Now, could we change existing games in this way? We could certainly introduce a victory point method in Risk to avoid elimination. For example, you could give players 1 point at the end of their turn for every territory they occupied, plus the extra army number of any continents that they occupied, and play for 5 turns or whatever, and whoever had the most points wins. Or play to a certain point number. In practice, the 2008 edition of Risk, which introduced mission cards, helped avoid player elimination because the game is much quicker and goes until somebody completes a certain number of missions. There are some diplomacy variants, and there are thousands of diplomacy variants. Sometimes the victory criterion is much less than half the centers, as opposed to the standard game where it's half the centers. And so player elimination is less common because the game ends before anybody can be eliminated. Now there's some other methods, and here's a list. And then I'm going to talk about each one individually. First is to let people play multiple nations. So if one nation's wiped out, you have more. In some of these, the nation control is predetermined. In other words, you know which nations you're going to have when you start the game. Ancient Conquest I was one of the games, if not the first game, to do this. You did play all your nations as allies at the same time, so it was almost like you had one nation, and they could cooperate to defend things, but they still had separate orders of battle and so on. There was no economy in Ancient Conquest I. In my own game, Britannia, and games like it, there is an economy, and the nations are entirely separate, and they're played one at a time. And if they encounter each other, they actually have to fight each other just as though they were entirely independent. But it's still the case that the player controls multiple nations. So in Britannia, usually a player has at least one nation and sometimes more on the board. There are exceptions when the yellow or the old purple player has no units in the board in mid-game if the Scots have done very poorly and been wiped out. Now, as opposed to predetermined nation control, we have games where it's the rise and fall of empires, and which empires you have are not predetermined. And these also have an arbitrary end in a number of rounds or points. History of the World would be the most well-known of these. Winky and its successor Small World are pretty well known. I have a historical game that will be published this year or next year with the title Eurasia, although that title is going to be changed. That is Rise and Fall of Empires. Another method is to have an inviolate home territory, that is, one that nobody can go into, and so even if you have nothing else on the board, you've got your home territory, and that gives you the opportunity to have several units or whatever you've got that you use in the game. I have several prototypes like that because I like that method quite a bit. Then in my prototype Seas of Gold, you can have your city be sacked, but then a treaty is imposed and you're back in the game. So you cannot be eliminated. In my Viking Gold prototype, you represent a sea king, and if you happen to die, then your son replaces you and you continue to play with a penalty and fame, I think it is, because after all you died. It's your son. Another method, which is pretty uncommon, is to have a player take over a non-player nation in games where the non-player nations are significant. And one of my games, which is scheduled for publication in early 2015, is Germania, or Germania is probably the proper pronunciation. It's a game of survival of the German nations after the fall of Rome. The Germans caused Rome to fall, and then they occupied the West Roman territories. But there are invaders all around. Some of them barbarians, some of them civilized, like Huns, Moors, Norse, Danes, Slavs, even the Byzantine Empire. And a player who's really down at his luck can take over one of those invaders rather than continue with his own position. That doesn't often end in a win, but it's a lot more interesting than dying. The last time this game was played, one player took over 3 different invaders. He finished last, but he had a good time. And I'm sure there are more methods than this, but this is a summary start.